And what's really interesting about this philosophy for yoga practitioners is that yoga is often translated as unite or to yoke, probably pretty universally in a lot of systems as well as in contemporary yoga. In this tradition, the goal is not to unite or yoke anything. In fact, it's the opposite. You want to disunite two things. You want to figure out a way to get that consciousness from not being misidentified with the mind, body, and world.
Hi, I'm Derek Mills. Welcome to the Glow Podcast. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali have had a profound impact on the development and practice of what we call yoga today. Digging into the origins and influences of the sutras is the topic of today's episode, guest hosted by Stephanie Serrano. For those of you who have listened to my interviews with Glow teachers and wondered who it was on Team Glow our teachers speak so lovingly about, well, Steph is one of them. Steph is an associate producer at Glow, and she'll introduce you to one of her favorite teachers, Dr. Christopher Miller. They met while she was a graduate student in yoga studies. They discussed the relationship between the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutras and how both texts shaped the British colonial presence in India. And fun fact, Chris was actually our first employee at Glow nearly 15 years ago. He eventually went on to complete his doctoral studies at UC Davis, a story which he'll share in today's episode. I'm honored to be friends with him. He's one of the loveliest humans I know, and I'm so proud of Chris and his journey. If you've ever been curious about where the Yoga Sutras came from, you'll really enjoy this episode. I hope you enjoy this in-depth conversation about the origins of yoga with Stephanie Serrano and Dr. Christopher Miller.
Hello, Glow listeners. My name is Stephanie, and I'm one of the associate producers for yoga here at Glow. I have the opportunity to work with our incredible teachers here on the platform to bring you all of the fresh content you experience each week. I'm so excited to be guest hosting on the podcast today. In today's episode, we'll discuss the Yoga Sutras, why they became the guiding text for modern yoga, and how the text has served as a catalyst for an evolved practice. I have the honor of introducing you all to one of my favorite teachers, Dr. Christopher Miller. I met Chris in 2018 when I was a graduate student of yoga studies. Chris is both a professor of Jain and Yoga Studies and is the co-founder and vice president of academic affairs at the Arihanta Institute. He is the author of Embodying Transnational Yoga and is a beacon for yoga scholars and practitioners wanting to deepen their knowledge of yogic studies. Welcome to the Glow Podcast, Chris.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for having me here, Stephanie. It's good to see you.
So great to see you, and thank you for joining us today. Well, today we're discussing how Patanjali's Yoga Sutras became the guiding text for modern yoga, and let's just jump right on in. My first question for you is, in Embodying Transnational Yoga, you mentioned that your grandmother's stories of the supernatural world sparked your curiosity about the complexity of religion and spirituality from an early age. How did that lead to your interest in yoga?
It's a long story, and I talk about it in the beginning of the book, but I'll give you the short version of that. So I was raised Catholic, as many yoga practitioners are. They're raised in some yoga or some religious tradition, and then they end up finding yoga. And I was raised on one side of my family in a very kind of Irish Catholic American background. And then on the other side of my family was my grandmother, who was from Manila, from the Philippines. And my grandfather had met her during World War II when he was in the U.S. Army. They came back, they got married, and they ended up moving to Southern California, not far from Santa Monica, where I know Glow at least began its origins. And in this area, it was where my family kind of was raised and brought up. And part of that upbringing for me was spending so much time with my grandmother from the Philippines. And bless her heart, she practiced a very different kind of Catholicism from the one that I was accustomed to in my daily practice at school. And this was this Catholicism that had come from the Philippines and had a lot of kind of supernatural stories and spirits and things attached to it that certainly were not showing up in the American version of Catholicism that I was also being raised in. And I found the differences between these traditions so fascinating. Here's this, the so-called Catholic tradition, but it's being practiced in two very different ways. And my grandmother used to tell us little ghost stories from the Philippines and stories about spirits and, to make it fun for us as kids. And it really was. And so from a very young age, I was instilled with this notion that religion is not only fascinating, spirituality is not only fascinating, but the differences within traditions and the kind of ways that they express themselves in different parts of the world was very interesting to me. And so I ended up going to college. I studied a little bit of theology, and I started to realize in Catholic theology that the Catholic tradition itself is fascinating with all these differences. I started to, as many people do in their 20s, explore various religious traditions. I went to Cal State Long Beach for a while and did some post-baccalaureate studies there, just to study in religious studies, just for fun, to explore traditions while I was working as a CPA. And then eventually decided to go to graduate school because I was just so into it. I just really wanted to study the yoga tradition and eventually the Jain tradition as well. We can talk about any of this as we go along. But I ended up going to Cal State Long Beach and then to graduate school. I eventually got my PhD from the University of California, Davis, in the study of religion, which was a very interdisciplinary approach to the study of yoga there, which resulted in the book Embodying Transnational Yoga that you mentioned. And so I study yoga, just so everybody knows my kind of approach. I study it philosophically, I study it historically, and I also study it primarily as a lived tradition, anthropologically. How do we as yoga practitioners around the world live our yoga and live these texts in everyday life?
I love that. And I can't wait to get into more of living that yoga in everyday life as we'll get into later in the episode. Thank you so much for sharing that. And before we dive into the Yoga Sutras itself, how would you describe the relationship between the Yoga Sutras and Samkhya philosophy?
This is a great question for people who are interested in studying yoga philosophically. And I know that you and I together in the classroom studied yoga philosophically in some dimensions. And a big part of that is that there's the Yoga Sutra, this text that is studied all around the world in a lot of different languages, originally written in Sanskrit. But the Yoga Sutra itself relies upon a philosophy called Samkhya. And when you start to dive deep into studying the Yoga Sutra, at some point you will have to go to Samkhya in order to understand what it is that you're encountering, if you want to encounter it and understand it in more of its original context, because the text has been reinterpreted in so many different ways. And this philosophy of Samkhya is a really important philosophy, not only for yoga, but for understanding traditions of religion in India more broadly. But we'll focus on the Yoga Sutra. So Samkhya, the word Samkhya itself means enumeration in Sanskrit. It means that you're counting something. It can mean accounting. And so it's a kind of spiritual accounting, if you will. And what it basically says is this: every single one of us has an individual soul or consciousness. It's sometimes described in other traditions as Atman, but in this tradition, the Sanskrit word for it is Purusha. So we all have a soul, we all have a self, we have this pure consciousness. And this pure consciousness is misidentified with everything around us, our mind, our body, and the entire world around us. And the reason we suffer is that we don't realize that there's this part of us that's free from all that chaos and all that suffering. And so the whole idea with Samkhya philosophy is that you develop and cultivate yourself on the one hand into someone who becomes unperturbed or imperturbed by the change in the mind and life and everything that happens all around us, all the stressors. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, you really gain a deep appreciation for an alternative worldview about how the mind and body relate to the world around us. And so the whole goal here is to free your Purusha from what is known as Prakriti, which is everything else that exists in the world, our mind, our body, and the world around us. And what's really interesting about this philosophy for yoga practitioners is that rather than trying to unite with something, yoga is often translated as unite or to yoke, probably pretty universally in a lot of systems as well as in contemporary yoga. In this tradition, the goal is not to unite or yoke anything. In fact, it's the opposite. We want to disunite two things. You want to figure out a way to get that consciousness from not being misidentified with the mind, body, and world. And so that's Samkhya philosophy very quickly in a nutshell. I know you've been in class with me and you've gone probably through the whole 2 or 3 hour lecture on it, but I won't give all those details to the listeners. But the basic idea is you want to free that consciousness from the suffering of the world that is going on all around you. And so then that philosophy, Samkhya, becomes the basis of this text that you're asking me about, the Yoga Sutra, which more people are probably more familiar with, especially if they've been through yoga teacher trainings or studied yoga philosophy. Usually one of the first texts you will study is the Yoga Sutra by Patanjali. And Samkhya, what I just described to you, having the self, trying to free it from its misidentification with the mind, body, and world, that philosophy, that outlook, that worldview is the foundation upon which Patanjali writes his entire yoga text and system, which provides a lot more practices for how to do that, how to, there's the 8-limbed yoga, the 3-part yoga as well. It gives us a lot of techniques and methods for realizing that philosophy, like to actually have an embodied experience of what that philosophy in Samkhya is trying to say. And so once again, I'll just reiterate and I'll end this part here. If you take that Samkhya philosophy and realize that it's the foundation of Patanjali's yoga, the goal of Patanjali's yoga, contrary to popular belief, is not to yoke or unite with anything. It's once again to find out a way to disunite your soul from everything that exists, that causes suffering in the first place.
Oh, I love that. And one of the reasons why I brought up this question is because of the first 4 verses in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, verse 3 and 4 say, when you begin to identify with Prakriti, you suffer. Or when you misidentify with Prakriti, you're suffering. And when you choose or take these practices of yoga into your daily life, you then begin to identify more with Purusha. You find that disassociation, as you mentioned, and you find more freedom and peace in your life. And yeah, I love that. It's taking the theory of yoga, if you want to say that, coming from Samkhya philosophy, and then you can turn it into this practice of yoga, which is outlined in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras.
That's a great way of putting it, Stephanie. Spoken like a true graduate student, or former graduate, I should say, of yoga studies.
Oh, thank you. I learned from the best. All right. Well, so who is Patanjali and how did the Yoga Sutras come into existence?
So I'll answer the question from both a kind of mythological perspective, like who is Patanjali, the story briefly of Patanjali, and then also a kind of historical perspective of what we know, which is not much. And so a very quick version of the story of Patanjali is that his mother was praying for a son, was here on earth, Gonika, and while she was praying for a son, down dropped into her open hands Patanjali. And it's a half man, half serpent, Patanjali, okay, that in this story, drops into her hands, this Patanjali, and there's the boy, right? This is the Patanjali who is going to teach yoga to the world, half man, half serpent, and having descended likely from Vishnu, from the Hindu god Vishnu, coming down to earth in some form of like an avatar to teach yoga to the world. And the name Patanjali itself comes from 2 primary parts in Sanskrit. Pat, the verbal root pat, which means to fall. So Patanjali fell, as I said, from the sky into his mother's open hands. And that second word, Anjali, we all probably know Anjali Mudra from yoga. We do it in yoga class all the time. So it means hands, open up in some kind of like prayerful way. So he fell, pat, into Anjali, into her open hands, and his name, therefore, is Patanjali. So that's the way the popular myth and story goes. And of course, this is a myth, and there are many versions of the story and different versions, but that's kind of one of the primary quick versions of that. Now, who is Patanjali historically as an author and figure of the Yoga Sutra is another question. And the answer to that is that nobody really knows historically. I mean, we don't have the evidence to say. There's a lot of references to Patanjali And some scholars think that Patanjali could be one author. Others say Patanjali is a number of authors writing under the name of Patanjali. Or the author could have just assumed the anonymous name Patanjali without giving their real name. So we don't really know, but we do have the text. And what we do know about the text is that it's a collection, it's a compendium of existing yoga practices from around the 4th or 5th century of the Common Era. So we're talking like 1,500, 1,600 years ago. And these are pre-existing practices that had been going on in different yoga traditions, from Buddhist, Brahmanical or Hindu, Jain, and other renouncer traditions who were in some way, shape, or form trying to achieve that goal of liberation, of some call it moksha, nirvana. Kaivalya is what it's called in the Yoga Sutra. And so this text takes all of these practices and it compiles them with the Samkhya philosophy into one text. And it's being compiled likely, as some scholars have shown, by Brahmins, by those who are the kind of precursors of what today we would call Hinduism. It's being compiled by Brahmanical elites who know Sanskrit, who can write Sanskrit, and have the ability and time to sit down and assemble these practices within this one text. And it was never really a text with a practice tradition, meaning there was no like lineage that we're aware of. It was more of a compendium from which many yoga traditions could draw inspiration, understanding of yoga, but it didn't have like a guru or an acharya or somebody attached to it who was actively teaching it. In fact, the opposite. It was just being cited and referenced throughout history, all the way into the present in various ways, and being drawn from as the sort of kind of go-to source text of yoga practice.
I love that. Hence the name Sutras. Suture. Perfect. Oh, well, thank you for that. Turning to another popular text that teacher trainings and yoga scholars look to is now the Bhagavad Gita. And you talked earlier about Purusha from Samkhya Yoga. And if you read the Bhagavad Gita, you notice that Purusha is referred to a lot in that text as well. So I'm curious if you could share how the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita are connected.
So the Bhagavad Gita comes or is written, we could say, over a span of time. We don't know the exact time period, but the time period, the centuries over which it's being written as a bigger part of an epic called the Mahabharata, is probably right around the same time that the Yoga Sutra is actually composed. So you have this text that's been in development and at some point becomes part of the Mahabharata. I'm talking about the Bhagavad Gita. And it is kind of coming to its last draft, maybe we could say, around the same time that the Yoga Sutra is being authored. So I'm talking about 4th or 5th century. It's very hard to date these texts. I don't have a precise date. Nobody does. But the idea in both of these texts is obviously that in some way, shape, or form, we're trying to achieve liberation once again. And in the Bhagavad Gita, as you say, you will find references to many different kinds of yoga, including Samkhya philosophy. So you'll find notions of the higher self, whatever you want to call it, Purusha or Atman, these various aspects that are used, or these various terms that are used to describe our higher self. And the goal, of course, once again, is to free our higher self from the suffering of the world. Now, that being said, the Bhagavad Gita presents yogas also that are not in the Yoga Sutra. We may be able to kind of like deduce them from the Yoga Sutra, but there are yogas in there that are very unique and have been celebrated all the way into the present. And many people will probably be familiar with these. First, probably most obvious one is karma yoga, which is the yoga where we are not attached to the fruit of our action. We don't get attached to the outcome. So if we don't have expectations going into certain situations, we can't be disappointed or happy, right? So, which is of course very hard to do for anyone. But the idea is that if you're not attached to the outcome of your action, then you'll be a more free and liberated person. You then offer those actions up to the divine. And in this particular text, that would be Vishnu or Krishna, the avatar of Vishnu. And in offering up your actions and everything you do to God or the divine or the absolute, however variously conceived, you will then once again not feel responsible for the outcome or be attached to the outcome of anything you do. So in that text, of course, it's Arjuna who's on the battlefield, and he's being told to fight by Krishna, and he's being told to fight against his cousins and kill his cousins. He's in this dilemma because he's a member of the warrior caste. He doesn't want to fight. But part of the whole concept and assumptions that are built into the Bhagavad Gita is this kind of caste and class system where you are born with a particular dharma. So for Arjuna, that was to be a warrior, to fight. And if you're born to fight, then you fight. You don't have a choice. If you're born to be in the military, you fight in the military. If you're born to be a merchant, you're a merchant. If you're born to be a priest, a Brahmin, you're a priest. And so Arjuna is really having a hard time performing his dharma because he has to fight. He's a warrior, and he's born into the warrior caste. And he says, I don't want to fight. Those are my cousins. And, Krishna basically tells him, like, through many different lessons of all these different yogas in the Gita, it's your duty to fight, get up and do it, right? And so, of course, this is very different from contemporary notions of dharma, especially in contemporary yoga, where people have a sense that they can kind of discover their dharma as part of their yoga practice, or their dharma will be kind of given to them, or they'll realize it somehow. They'll discover their dharma. In this particular text, you're just born with it, right? You don't get to choose. You have to do what you were born to do. And the background on that text is that in the Yoga Sutra, for example, you have all of these people who are like very countercultural, leaving society, who don't want to fight in wars, who don't want to be involved in all the suffering of the world. And the Bhagavad Gita is written as a kind of, from a socio-historical, political standpoint, it's written as a treatise to convince people to not go out into the forest, to not be countercultural, to stay in caste and class hierarchy, and to do what you're told. And so on the one hand, it's very liberating. If you can just listen, it's nice for someone to just tell you what to do. You got to fight, go do what you do, and believe that it's like divinely ordained. And on the other hand, you can see, like, from a Marxist perspective, how this is really trying to get people to obey, right? So it's not so countercultural. The Gita is not so countercultural as we might think that it is. So there's a lot more I could say about it, but that's kind of the relationship between the text and what the Gita is kind of trying to do historically. And it's been reinterpreted, of course, in many ways through the ages.
I think that's actually a perfect segue. Speaking of counterculture and going off and taking your practice into the forest, you write about the Yoga Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita during the American counterculture in your new book. What defines modern yoga, and what led these texts to be some of the main sources to reference for modern practitioners?
So in the book, in the very beginning, I kind of challenged the notion of calling it modern in the sense that, like, we've entered a new age. But I think for people, like, popularly understanding, when we say modern yoga, we're talking about right now. We're talking about contemporary yoga. We're talking about yoga maybe since the counterculture, maybe earlier, right? So I tend to use the term contemporary. And what does all this have to do with contemporary yoga? It has a lot to do, because, as you said, in my book, the first chapter is all about how the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga Sutra enter into the American counterculture and get totally reinterpreted and reworked by the practitioners who are interpreting the text, right? So you have a text, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, that in India had been used to try to get people to kind of do their duty and stay in class society, go to war, do whatever they were supposed to do, and see it as divinely ordained. That text then comes over to the American counterculture, and as I read in this first book, it's being picked up in these yoga communities who are picking up on the ideas that have been already kind of filtered through a colonial history that we can talk about momentarily. I won't go into it yet, but they're picking up on ideas such as, I said, karma yoga, as I've described it to you here, and as people would popularly understand it, that I can perform action in the world, selfless service in the world. It's being reinterpreted as selfless service. And I can serve people around me. And it's this very kind of like romantic idea that we're here for each other, and it's a good idea, right? And we serve each other, and we're not attached to the outcome of our actions. So in my book, I show how this comes into the American counter cuisine movement, which is like a big restaurant movement that happens in the United States during the counterculture, where they're serving all kinds of vegetarian and vegan food to kind of push back against the establishment and push back against harm, ahimsa, the first of the yamas in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, for example. And they're really trying to make the world a better place. And the way that they're able to kind of get along with each other is by interpreting and reinterpreting Arjuna's battle on the battlefield as a battle that they're fighting in the contemporary moment. Meaning when they go to work together and they don't get along, and it's really hard to work with people in a restaurant setting, for anyone who's worked in food service knows, the guru in this chapter is helping them reinterpret their experience as like, hey, you're Arjuna on the battlefield. You're just doing your dharma. And you're in this restaurant labor workforce, whatever you want to call it. You're serving customers. You're rubbing shoulders with people you don't get along with at work. Don't be attached to all that. Just let it go. And so I really found that particular approach to the Bhagavad Gita unique. And it was an approach that was really created in a major way during the American counterculture. So I write about how restaurant service and karma yoga and these other yogic principles of ahimsa all kind of come into this big food movement at the ashram that I'm writing about in there. So that's kind of how yoga comes into the counterculture. Again, there's a lot more to it. I know we don't have a ton of time, but the idea is that these texts that have been already labeled as authoritative in colonial India have made their way over to the United States and are becoming authoritative once again, but being reinterpreted by those people through their particular lenses in their particular moment.
So much to talk about with Dharma too, and being in community and almost using your challenging situations that you might find yourself in, such as working in a restaurant and how that relates into other situations we might find ourselves in, but transcending those challenging moments and using those as a spiritual tool and living your dharma in that way. Thank you. Moving along, the Yoga Sutras have been popularized as modern yoga's guiding light. Yet I've noticed a lack of discussion on the third pada, which outlines the siddhis or powers that can be attained through the practice of yoga. Why do you think that is?
This question is good because it requires us to go back before the American counterculture to see what happened. Why are we even studying these texts, the Yoga Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita and Hatha Yoga texts? Many of the texts people in yoga worlds would be familiar with. And if we go back to the colonial period when the British have totally colonized India, and particularly in North India and around Bengal and Delhi and all these areas, there's a project going on. And that project is a very colonial project. And it is this: if you want to control and dominate a culture, in this case, Indian culture, this goes for colonization anywhere, right? You have to understand their language. You have to understand their religion. You have to understand their law. You have to understand the way they think and try to control the way they think, or tell them the proper way to think using their own cultural resources through which they will understand. And that's exactly what the British are doing in colonial India. So you can imagine if you're British, you're coming to India, you're bringing your own kind of Protestant Christian background and assumptions to the world, your own assumptions about what modernity means and what it means to be modern. And you're coming to India and you want to extract resources, you want to colonize people, you want to control people. One of the first things you do is you try to understand their religion. And during this time period, there were colonial Orientalists, people from Britain, from Europe, who came in and started to ask, what are your religious texts? Show me your religious texts. What religious texts are your Bibles? What is your Bible, right? So the Bhagavad Gita is one story in that. And I teach a whole class on this. The Bhagavad Gita is one of it's been called the Hindu Bible for good reason, but it's used as the kind of Bible of Hinduism. For yoga, when all these European Orientalists are searching for the kind of holy grail of yoga, the text that they end up landing on is the Yoga Sutra. Why? There's a lot of reasons why, but one of the reasons, as I said before, is that it didn't have a practice lineage attached to it. It was a kind of free-floating source text that gave a very pure meditational kind of ethical yoga, right? It's grounded in nonviolence. It focuses on meditation. It focuses on just kind of purifying yourself. And so that particular kind of yoga, which is mostly, and I'll get to your question about the cities here, but that kind of yoga was the kind of yoga that the British thought was great and that colonizers thought was great, because it wasn't a yoga that necessarily sought power. And in fact, when you go into the third chapter of the Yoga Sutra, where you're mentioning, you find that you can actually gain power from yoga. And this is a very interesting idea that through the practice of yoga, you can become very powerful and gain various siddhis, as you said. One of those siddhis, and one of the main practices of yoga before everything we think we know about yoga, was to enter into and take over other people's bodies, for example, or to read people's minds. And when you hear things like that, especially today, if you're a yoga practitioner and you haven't studied yet the history of yoga, that doesn't sound like anything that we're doing in a contemporary yoga studio. I mean, it really doesn't, right? So there's all these powers listed. You can levitate, you can do different things. And that part of the text and that part of yoga practice in general, like the power seeking, power grabbing aspects of yoga to be able to control the world around you and do all sorts of cool things, were things that were looked down upon by the British, right? Obviously. Now, why was that? It was because at this time in colonial India, there were yogis who were hundreds of thousands, as David Gordon White writes about this, hundreds of thousands of ascetic yogi warriors who were killers. They controlled trade routes, they brokered power, they were militant, they had weapons, they fought better, they scared the British, and rightfully so, right? So they were really the only force that could really stand up to colonial power, and they were there. I mean, this has been written by historians, I'm not just making this up, and they were a threat to British power. And so what the British did was they canonized, or they made authoritative certain yoga texts that made those yogis look like they're not practicing the authentic yoga. When I say the authentic yoga, we might think of like a true yogi as somebody who is about peace and who's up in the Himalayas or who's in the forest or who's meditating and being nice to everybody around them. When in fact, historically, this just certainly was not the case. There were yogis, hundreds of thousands of them, in fact, that were not doing that. And because they were a threat to British power, the British started to really focus on emphasizing parts of texts as true and not true. And the Yoga Sutra, its third pada, as you said, which often doesn't get studied in yoga teacher trainings, describes a lot of these powers that were potentially threatening to the British. And so since forever, I think people have always tried to grapple with that third chapter. What do we do with this chapter? And the kind of Western interpretation of that chapter, or the safe interpretation, is to say those powers are a distraction on the way to enlightenment because they indicate that you have some attachment to worldly power. And if you have attachment to worldly power, that's karmically unbeneficial. You need to get rid of all your desire and all your attachment to the world to be a true yogi. But for those yogis, being a true yogi was actually to pursue worldly power. And so there's this constant conflict in yoga traditions between gaining worldly power and detaching from worldly power and renouncing worldly power. And because that third chapter has such kind of bizarre things that are so different from everything else we encounter in the Yoga Sutra, oftentimes in yoga teacher trainings, I think teachers just don't simply know what to do with it. But it's such a fascinating aspect of the history of yoga more broadly and the Yoga Sutra itself that it really needs to be studied and considered, because it forces us to confront this colonial history and struggle of power between yogi warriors and the British trying to basically eradicate and destroy them, which is what they ended up doing. They ended up making that kind of yoga illegal. There are legal documents that I show in my modern yoga class that these yogis were actually banned and outlawed by the British as illegal. They were told to leave Calcutta, where the British East India Company was controlling India from. Leave Calcutta, get out of here, you're banned, you're illegal, and eventually were eradicated, so that the only yoga that could remain, and they did legalize, were the meditational forms of yoga that were going on that were very bhakti oriented, very devotional, and very meditative. Those people were allowed to stay. So you can see the colonial binary that's created between evil yogi and good yogi, and how it served colonial interests. And in fact, how today we inherit this history. And so we don't know what to do with that third chapter about powers. because it's but it forces us to confront that colonial history.
And would you consider this is kind of moving a little bit more forward in time when we start to learn about neck up yoga versus neck down yoga? Would you say that siddhis and those powers are still considered neck up, or would you consider that neck down yoga?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you remember this from all the way back in 2017 or 2018. We read Andrea Jain's book about this, Selling Yoga, which I'm sure some people have heard of. And Andrea Jain kind of splits these yogas into yoga from the neck up, as you're describing, which are these very meditative, disembodied yogas where you're just kind of in your head, meditating, giving devotion, versus neck down yogas, which are very much concerned with worldly power because they're having to do with everything from the neck down, satisfying everything from the neck down. The body is kind of the distinction that's being made. And I think, this is a dichotomy, an artificial dichotomy that's created during this colonial period, whereas it was hard to distinguish these things from one another. If you go into certain yoga texts, like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, for example, everyone just assumes that Hatha Yoga is a physical practice, a purely physical practice. But when you go into those texts, Hatha Yoga is both a physical and mental and emotional and spiritual practice all combined into one. So this binary between neck up and neck down that was artificially created to kind of say neck up yoga is okay, neck down yoga is not okay, was an artificial binary that really kind of like betrays the complexity and the actual what's written in yoga texts in many ways. Like the body, you can't separate one from the other, right? This dualism between head up and head down. It's just not possible. It's a very colonial way of thinking.
Yeah. Well, in your book and in the classes that I've taken with you, we've considered the historical development of yoga and what it means to practice it today. What is new about the way we practice the Yoga Sutra today, and what has remained the same?
Yeah, and I guess you're comparing it to before, like the Yoga Sutra, if we were to kind of read it very closely, carefully, and try to understand from its commentaries and stuff, this is how it was probably practiced, for example, right? Versus like, here's how it's practiced today, and what's stayed the same, what's changed. And this is like one of the questions I think in yoga studies that we try to pursue. I just got back from Hamburg. We had a conference there that we organized called Yoga Darshana, Yoga Sadhana, where we had all of the really big yoga scholars from around the world meet. And you always see people struggling with this question of like continuity and discontinuity. What remains from before and what has changed? And it's very complicated. And in fact, I think that that's one of the primary questions that makes yoga studies possible or makes it interesting. We've talked about some of these things as we've gone along here, but another interesting one that I haven't mentioned yet and that I know you'll probably remember and you probably teach yourself is that the Yoga Sutra is not concerned in any major way with asana or postural practice. Asana is, of course, one of the limbs of yoga, one of the 8 limbs of yoga, but it only has, a few sutras out of 195 or 196 sutras dedicated to it in this whole text. There are way more things dedicated to the powers, for example. So why aren't we talking about that? And what has happened is that this text that mentions asana or posture as a seated posture generally to meditate in has now been grafted into this modern postural practice where it's basically almost all about posture, or at least disproportionately about posture, and maybe a little bit of breathing and a little shavasana or something that's still even a posture. And so there's this big, one of the things that's been studied fairly frequently by scholars of modern yoga is how did that happen? How is it that this text has become the mainstay for postural yoga practitioners? It has a very long history that I teach in classes and things like that. I won't go over all of it right now, but I will just say that the overemphasis on asana and the underemphasis on other things like the ethical principles, for example, even meditation. More people are practicing pranayama now. I love that. But the powers and the philosophy and the rich Samkhya philosophy you described, a lot of that gets kind of lost and somehow the text itself becomes a sort of manual for making people who are practicing feel like they have a resource to draw from. But if they read it closely enough, they'll see that there's not much of what you're doing on the mat is necessarily in that text, right? I mean, of course, there's ways that it has been interpreted as in the contemporary period as leading to that. So for example, there is this kind of loophole I tell all my asana students that you can focus basically on anything that will give you one-pointedness according to the Yoga Sutra. So if asana does that, and this is how Iyengar and others have interpreted it, if asana does that, then why not? Why, if asana can bring me to a place of one-pointedness and stillness, then that could be that one method. But again, if you read through the text, I don't think you will see your asana practice reflected the way that it's being practiced today, right? So in some ways, it opens up a lot of opportunities and gateways for people to go deeper. And it's a kind of entry point for people to go deeper in their yoga studies, which is a good thing because it'll make them realize that there's so much more to this. And it's such a rich tradition, and it could really transform your entire life. I mean, the asana itself is transformative, right? But if you were to incorporate all of the various limbs into your life, how transformative could that be? So that's where you see, it kind of gives us a tool to dig deeper, and then it hopefully will get us to ask more questions about yoga. And if what I'm doing, a lot of people ask if what they're doing is authentic or traditional, and those are really difficult questions to ask. But at least there's some inspiration in this text to explore further beyond the asana.
Absolutely. And we can see, as if you look at the text and the practice over time, how much the practice has changed. And so for a lot of folks, as you've spoken to, who have used asana as a gateway into the rest of their yoga practice and their yoga studies, they can then further ask those questions. And so they might find themselves opening up the Yoga Sutras. And one were to read and practice the Yoga Sutra, how can this text help further provide that practitioner and their communities with new pathways to a better world? What is your take on how this text can help inspire a practitioner to bring these practices and these theories into their everyday lives and to the people that they interact with?
That's an excellent follow-up, I think, to everything we've been talking about here, that question. And I'm remembering now back to, as the reader, the listeners will eventually probably learn, that I was the first employee at Glow way back in the day in Santa Monica when I was in graduate school. And, I remember when Glow started offering courses on Yoga Sutra, and scholars started coming to the studio to teach the students, not just Yoga Sutra, but other tantric texts and other really cool things. And I remember that was opening so many gateways for people who were really thirsty, who came to yoga in the first place because they were thirsty for some kind of spiritual path, some kind of way of understanding and comprehending suffering, and for community, and for all the things that people come to yoga for. But at some point people get there, and then they feel, once they've done the asana for a long time, they're like, okay, but now what next? What comes next? And I really think that those early experiences that I had at Glow for me were formative in ways that they are for others, and that you start to meet teachers who are offering alternative ways of being in the world that are grounded in ethical frameworks that we are not accustomed to, such as those like Patanjali that are grounded in nonviolence, ahimsa, in living a more simple lifestyle, being kinder not only to other human beings, but being kind to everything that exists, right? Part of my own transformation through yoga, as many people know, is I initially became vegetarian as a result, as many yoga people do. And then I was inspired even more to become vegan because of this tradition. These are things I would have never considered had I not studied the yoga tradition, the Jain tradition as well, and other religious texts that are emphasizing that spiritual transformation requires an ethical engagement with the world, with everything that is around you. It really questions the way that we've been socially conditioned to be in the world. And what these texts allow us to do, and what the teachers allow us to do and help us to do, I think, is to embody, as my book says, embody that yoga philosophy now, in the here and now. It's going to require reinterpretation. It's going to require deep reflection, but it's also going to help us interrogate all of these social conditionings and things we've been accustomed to doing our entire life that we never really questioned. Yoga really gives us an opportunity to do that. And so both individually and as in community. So I really do think that despite, you've been in my modern yoga class and we look at kind of the dark sides of yoga, how could it be connected to capitalism and contribute to like environmental degradation? And, these are questions that I've been asking for a long time that I write about. But at the same time, I will never kind of lose hope that the philosophy itself, if really deeply reflected upon and practiced by people, could make a significant impact in the world, the way that we interact with one another, especially in light of all the things that are going on right now. And so a lot of the work that not just myself, but my colleagues and I do is try to take these texts, try to take these ideas, try to take these philosophies and teach them in a way that shows that, this is calling us to a higher purpose, to be a better version or the best possible version of ourselves. And it's worth it. It's both worth it because it's good for society and it's good for us simultaneously.
Well said. Thank you. Oh my gosh, you are just such a wealth of knowledge, Chris. And it has been such a pleasure speaking with you on this episode today. I know that there's so much more you can say about the Yoga Sutras. And we would love to know, our listeners would love to know how we can connect with you, how else we can learn from you. If you could share a little bit more about how we can all stay connected.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from listeners, even just to get a message from you, say hello and you listen. I always love to hear that. Thank you, Stephanie, for having me on. I'm on Instagram at The Yoga Professor. So just at The Yoga Professor, I can share that handle with you. I'm also on Facebook, of course. I do a little bit of social media, but I have so much work, it's hard for me to keep up. But I am in those places. And then I'm also the co-founder and the vice president of academic affairs and professor, as you said, at Arihanta Institute. I can also share that link as well. It's just arihantainstitute.org. Maybe hard to spell if you're not familiar with the tradition, but we do offer all kinds of courses, short courses we're a nonprofit. So these courses are extremely affordable. If you're interested in learning more about all the things I've talked about, we have courses on this that are really underpriced, I think, but it's because, we're a nonprofit educational institute. And we also have a graduate degree program through which we offer a concentration in yoga studies, where we dive deep into everything I've spoken about today, the philosophy, the history, and the anthropology and contemporary practice of yoga. This is all online training, so you don't have to be anywhere. I'm in Zurich, but I train from Zurich, and I'd be happy to hear from you through any of those modalities. If you want to talk to me, just check in with me, or if you're interested in further studies, I'm happy to meet people, as I regularly do, to tell them more about our graduate offerings and graduate program.
And I can speak from experience. I've taken many classes with Chris, and there's just amazing discussion and insightful conversations that come up in class. So I highly recommend checking out his classes online at Arihanta Institute. Stay connected with him on social media. He's a great, great resource. And again, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stephanie. It was really a pleasure, and I'm very happy to see my graduate students now doing such wonderful things. So thank you so much, and thank you to Glow and the whole team.
Thank you to our entire team behind the scenes at Glow. I'm so grateful for your care and commitment to serving our members around the world. Thank you to our teachers for so beautifully sharing your gifts and talents. I'm also grateful to our lovely community of Glow members. You've supported us since 2008, and because of you, we get to continue to do the work we love. It's the combined support of our team, our teachers, and our community that grants me the privilege to continue to bring you the Glow podcast. Thank you to Lee Schneider at Red Cub Agency for production support, and the beautiful music you're hearing now is by Carrie Rodriguez and her husband Luke Jacobs. And remember, take care of yourself because our world needs you. Thank you for coming on this journey with me. You can find the Glow Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or glo.com/podcast, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Derek Mills.